Chapter 11. Naya's Legacy. Even more troubled now, Zenith climbed to the rooftop of Sigholt. She stood and watched the lights shut out one by one in the town of Lakesview on the other side of the lake. She let the warm breeze caress her, and briefly contemplated a flight over the lake and hills. But she was tired, her mind full of problems, and she preferred to lean over the wall of the roof and let the view soothe her. Determined not to think of Wolfstar, or Zared and Leah's troubles, or even Drago, Zenith fixed her thoughts on Riverstar's claim to have found a new lover, and one she might wed? Zenith almost laughed aloud. Maybe her lover considered marrying Riverstar, but Zenith doubted seriously that her sister would ever go that far. She enjoyed her freedoms too much to discard them for fidelity. Unless her lover were Sunsore. A Sunsore might well tempt Riverstar, but who was available to her here in Sigholt if not First Blood? Zenith frowned. Freefall? But Freefall was impossible. He and his wife Evensong were virtually inseparable, and Evensong was here with him. Besides, who could ever think of Freefall and Riverstar? No, that was laughable, surely. And Wolfstar? Wolfstar was here. How much longer had he been about before he made his presence known? His penchant for disguise was legendary, and if he was Riverstar's new lover, had he been coming to her in the guise of a stable boy, or himself? No, not Wolfstar. Zenith did not want to think of him at all. Although remember the way he'd kissed Riverstar this morning? Was that boldness or familiarity? Israel! Zenith forced her mind as far from Wolfstar as she could. Was Israel First Blood? She supposed he was, for he and Riverstar shared a Sunsore father. But then Israel had changed so much since he'd become Mage King of the Avar that it was as if his Sunsore link was gone. Although he still had the blood to satisfy Riverstar, if indeed it were him. No, surely not Israel. He had only been here since this morning, hadn't he? When had Israel arrived? Oh, for the sweet star's sake, Zenith murmured. Riverstar is probably just making it all up anyway. She looked down to the far courtyard, her enchanter vision having no trouble picking out every detail in the thick night shadow. A guard moved from barrack to gate. Another checked the doors to the weapons room off the main building. A movement? Drago. Zenith sharpened her vision, then smiled gently, her eyes soft. He was feeding scraps of meat to the courtyard cats. 5 or 6 had gathered, mewling about his legs, reaching up to pat his knees with their paws. He laughed and squatted down to scratch them, their heads butting against his arms and chest affectionately. Zenith had never realized he liked cats so much, nor that they obviously adored him. All the food was gone, but still they stayed, winding about him. Her face softened yet more. Someone besides herself in this great keep liked the man. Drago stood up, extracted himself from the cats, and stepped back inside. Zenith watched for a few more minutes, but he did not reappear. She sighed and moved to the parapets that overlooked the lake, resting her elbows on the wall, her chin in her hands, lost in thought. Sigholt was now completely quiet. The dogs were curled in sleep. The guards seemed to have turned to stone at their posts. Silence and stillness reigned. Zenith felt as if she had been transported to another world. Even the breeze had disappeared. Her wings relaxed and drifted over the flagstones behind her. She sank into a greater lethargy, leaning her full weight on the wall, watching the waves ripple across the moonlit lake of life. Zenith did not notice the tiniest of movements in the air about her, nor catch the enchantment that rippled over the rooftop. I find it not strange that I have discovered you atop Sigholt, Wolfstar said, and she whirled around, her heart pounding. He stood relaxed and easy, his wings drooped behind him in the traditional Akari gesture of goodwill. For so once Stardrifter found Rivka and loved her, and so Axis found Azure and loved her too. No, do not lift off. Stay and talk with me, Zenith. You have nothing to fear. Then why does my heart race so, Zenith thought, and my breast heave with such fright? She steadied herself, although her eyes flickered about, seeking reassurance of another person close by. There was no one save her and Wolfstar. A movement above her against the dome. Zenith gasped, her eyes involuntarily jerking upward. There was nothing there save the swirling stars. Nothing. "Do you remember, sweet Zenith," Wolfstar said very softly, "when last you saw me? Do you remember that night so long ago?" A shadow spiraling down from the roof of the dome. "No," Zenith whispered, grabbing the parapets for support. "No, we have never met before this morning." Something was happening. The night air of Sigholt was swirling about her, and every few heartbeats it seemed to solidify until she felt as if she were inside an empty building, a dome. "No, no! Zenith, do not fear. You are only remembering. Accept." Wolfstar walked slowly toward her, and as he did so, he lifted his hand in the demanding gesture of seduction that male enchanters use to will women to their bed. No, she could not move, and her mind voice seemed to have vanished. She was trapped. He was too powerful. "Yes, Zenith. Here, let me remind you." He was close now, gathering her stiff body in his arms, and Zenith struggled uselessly, wondering if he was intent on rape. She felt his arms about her, and it was good. No, it wasn't good. Yet something seemed to have taken possession of her. Some part of her mind willed her to cease resisting and let Wolfstar slide her onto the floor. Some part of her was saying, "You have bedded with him previously." No! She twisted her head away, but Wolfstar was too powerful for her. Both his body and his power were too strong, and she felt his mouth close over hers. And something happened. Something broke free. Something struggled free within her. Memories, voices, scents, laughter not her own crowded her mind. Faces, experiences, songs she'd never heard before leaped out of hiding. A desire she'd never felt flooded her body. She felt him enter her body, move with her, and she had never believed it could feel this good, had never believed that such intimacy could engender such feeling, and no, what was wrong with her? His mouth was on hers, that was all. All? She could not escape it. She could not escape him. She twisted under him, encouraging him with body and voice, willing him on to even greater effort, willing him to merge so completely with her body and soul that they would indeed become one, and not just two bodies briefly conjoined in an act designed only for child engendering. Zenith tore her mouth from his. No! She broke away from him, yet even as she stumbled 5 or 6 paces away from him, she felt the fire that had seeded in her womb explode into new life, and she screamed and fell to the floor, doubling over, clutching at her belly. Her wings beat futilely behind her, and almost knocked Wolfstar over as he leaned down and grabbed her, holding her tightly against him, trying to stifle her sobs. "Zenith, your mother was wrong not to tell you this before." "Tell me what?" "That you were born to be my lover, Zenith, meant for no one else. Why else are you still a virgin at your age? Here I am, Zenith. Accept me. Zenith, you love me. Accept me." And the dreadful thing was Zenith could feel that love, could remember the nights she had lain in her lonely bed, wishing he would return to her, crying as the night lightened to dawn and he had not appeared. She could remember years spent loving him, and she could remember months spent watching her belly swell with his child. "No!" she shouted once more, and lunged from his arms, using both limbs and wings. Her hips struck the sharp edge of a parapet over the courtyard, and she cried out, her arms flailing. Wolfstar lunged at her, but he was too late, and Zenith tumbled over the edge of the roof, gaining control of her wings only feet from the ground, and landing roughly enough to scrape hands and knees. "Help me! Help me!" And suddenly Drago was there. "Oh, stars!" he cried and fell to his knees, gathering her into his arms. The 2 guards from the gates started to run toward them, but Drago waved them back. A slip, nothing more. Then, her sobbing face pressed into his chest, he held her tight, rocking her back and forth. "Zenith, what is it? What is it?" Zenith clung to her brother, sobbing. letting his closeness and warmth and touch drive away her memories and the feeling of Wolfstar. In the rectangle of light behind Drago, another figure appeared. "Zenith! Drago, what have you done to her? Let her go!" "Salem," Zenith sobbed, trying to say that it was all right, that Drago was helping, not hurting. But the words would not come, and Salem reached down and literally tore her from Drago's arms. "Get you gone from here," Salem snarled at Drago, who had backed away, his eyes swinging between Salem's face and Zenith, now clinging to her eldest brother. "I was only helping," he began, but Salem reached out with his power and cut off Drago's words. "I do not want to hear your excuses. Get you gone from here." Drago's face twisted, trying to form words, but Salem would not let them come, and with a gesture of half rage, half frustration, he disappeared inside the kitchen door. "Sweetheart," Salem whispered, gathering Zenith more tightly into his arms, and then the music of a song of movement rippled about them, and they disappeared from the courtyard. She came to her senses, still wrapped in Salem's arms, but now sitting on one of the commodious couches in the inner private chamber of his apartments. "Where's Drago?" she said, sniffing, wiping her nose with a cloth Salem handed her. "He fled." "Did he push you?" No, I stumbled from the rooftop. Wolfstar was there." "Ah, Wolfstar. He is truly the bane of our lives. Did he hurt you?" "No," Zenith said, but she spoke so hesitatingly that Salem took her shoulders and pushed her back a little so he could see her face. "He did," he said slowly. "He did hurt you. How?" Zenith probably would have confessed to the first person who showed her kindness, be it Salem or an unknown dairymaid. Words came tumbling out of her mouth. "Wolfstar, on the roof, kissed me. Thoughts, images not mine, crowded me, frightened me." Salem pulled her close again, stroking her hair. "Go on." His eyes were distant. Zenith gripped her hands together in an effort to stop them shaking. "He appeared suddenly, and that surprised me, but then I felt as if I was in a chamber of some kind. The dome of the moon. It was very dark. I felt there was something there, clinging to the roof. It frightened me, terrified me. I was there. I saw that place, and yet I have never been inside it in my life." She raised her head, enough to look Salem in his eyes. "I felt as though I was someone else. Memories crowded my mind, memories that were not mine. Oh, Salem." And in another flood she told him of the lost hours, and the nightmares and the fears. Who was this who crowded her mind, and who sometimes took such possession of her that she could not remember what she had done? Who? "Salem, I do not know what to think, what to do." "Hush," Salem said, holding her tight, stroking her hair back, kissing the crown of her head. "Hush." Thoughts and memories crowded his own mind, but they were not of someone else's making. He remembered the time 9 years ago when Axis and Azure had handed control of Tensendor over to him. True, there had been a glittering ceremony in the shores of Grail Lake, but there had been a far more private afternoon, when his parents had handed into his keeping some of the most precious items of their lives. The Rainbow Scepter, now carefully secreted within Sigholt. The Wolven Bow, for Azure had said she no longer needed to ride to the hunt. The enchanted quiver of arrows, which never ran out. A moonwild flower, and a letter addressed to Azure and written by her long-dead mother, Naya. No one save Azure could remember Naya, for she had died when Azure was only about 6. Naya had been the first priestess on the island of Mist and Memory, when one night Wolfstar had appeared to her, lain with her, and got Azure upon her. Within 7 years Naya was dead, burned alive at the hands of her plow-keeper husband Hagen in the cursed village of Smirton. But she had left Azure a letter, and when Azure had given it to Salem, she told him that one day he must hand it to Zenith. "You will know when, Salem. You will know the moment." And this was the moment. Trembling, for he had never read the letter, he did not know what it was, Salem gently disengaged himself and left the room. Zenith sat up straight, dried her eyes, and shook her hair out. grateful for the support and love Salem had shown her, but wishing she could have explained about Drago. Salem was back within a few minutes, holding an envelope in his hands. Salem, Drago was only— Hush, let us not speak of him. Zenith, read this. Maybe it will help you understand. Puzzled, Zenith took the letter. Across the envelope there was a word scratched in bold ink, Azure. Even more bewildered, Zenith looked at Salem. The writing was in Zenith's own hand. Who wrote this? Naya, Azure's mother. Naya? Read it, Zenith. Zenith dropped her eyes to the letter, quashing the sudden wave of apprehension that almost engulfed her. She opened the envelope and took the letter out, hands trembling, and she unfolded it and began to read, her eyes skipping over the irrelevant passages. My dearest daughter Azure, my long life and joy be yours forever. 5 nights ago you were conceived, and tonight, after I put down my pen and seal this letter, I will leave this blessed isle. I will not return, but one day I hope you will come back. 5 nights ago your father came to me. It was the fullness of the moon, and it was my privilege, as first priestess, to sit and let its light and life wash over me in the dome of the moon. I heard his voice before I saw him. Naya. A voice resonant with power whispered through the dome, and I started, because it was many years since I had heard my birth name. Naya. The voice whispered again, and I trembled in fear. Were the gods displeased with me? Had I not honored them correctly during my years on this sacred isle and in this sacred temple? Naya. The voice whispered yet again, and my trembling increased, for despite my lifetime of chastity, I recognized the timbre of barely controlled desire, and I was afraid. I stood, my eyes frantically searched the roof overhead for long moments. I could see nothing. Then a faint movement caught my eye. A shadow was spiraling down from the roof of the dome. The shadow laughed and spoke my name again as he alighted before me. I have chosen you to bear my daughter, he said, and he held out his hand, his fingers flaring. Her name will be Azure. At that moment my fear vanished, as if it had never existed. Azure? Azure? I had never seen such a man as your father, and I know I will not again during this life. His wings shone gold, even in the dark night of the dome. His hair glowed with copper fire. His eyes were violet, and they were hungry with magic. Azure, as priestess of the stars, we are taught to accede to every desire of the gods, even if we are bewildered by their wishes. But I went to him with willingness, not with duty. I wore but a simple shift, and as his eyes and fingers flared wider, I stepped out of it and walked to meet his hand. And his hand grasped mine, and it was as if I was surrounded by song, as if his mouth captured mine. It was as if I was enveloped by the surge of the stars in their dance. His power was so all-consuming that I knew he could have snuffed out my life with only a thought. Perhaps I should have been terrified, but he was gentle for a god. Not what I might have expected, and if he caused me any pain that night, I do not remember it. But what I do remember— Azure, perhaps you have had your own lover by now, but do you know what it feels like to lie with one who can wield the power of the stars through his body? At times, I know he took me perilously close to death, as he wove his enchantments through me, and made you within my womb. But I trusted him, and let him do what he wanted, and lay back in his wings as he wrapped them about me, and yielded with delight, and garnered delight 5-fold in return. Zenith blinked, for it was as if she were there, feeling this, not reading it. She could remember writing these words, remember sitting there for almost an hour at this point, her mouth curling softly in memory of that night of passion and loving. She had not known his name then, but that had not mattered very much, not when she had his body to grasp to her, not when both she and he burned with such desire. Zenith shuddered. Gods! What was happening to her? Even as he withdrew from my body, I could feel the fire that he had seeded into my womb erupt into new life. He laughed gently at the cry that escaped my lips and at the expression in my eyes, but I could see his own eyes widen to mirror the wonder that filled mine. For a long time we lay still, his body heavy on mine, our eyes staring into each other's depths, as we felt you spring to life within my womb. Zenith's mouth formed the word no, but she did not voice it. She was no longer in her mother's chamber in Sigholt, but lying on the cold floor of the Dome of the Moon, staring into Wolfstar's eyes as he lay atop her. After a moment she managed to regain enough control so she could resume reading the letter. Naya wrote of how the god, Wolfstar, had told her she would have to travel to Smirton, wed the local plow-keeper Hagen, and bear her child. There the child, Azur, would eventually meet the Starman. I know that I will die in Smirton, and I know the man your father sends me to meet and to marry will also be my murderer, and I know that my days will be numbered from the hour that I give birth to you. It is a harsh thing that your father makes me do, for how will I be able to submit to this plow-keeper Hagen, knowing that I will die at his hands, and keep a smile light on my face and my body willing? How can I submit to any man having known the God who fathered you? How can I submit to a life dominated by the hated brotherhood of the Seneschal when I have been first priestess of the Order of the Stars? Your father saw my doubts and saw my future pain, and he told me that one day I will be reborn to be his lover forever. No, 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 no. Zenith shook as the implications of what she was reading began to sink in. No. He said that he had died and yet lived again, and that I would follow a similar path. He said that he loved me. Perhaps he lied, but I choose not to think so. To do otherwise would be to submit to despair. His promise, as your life, will keep me through and past my death into the next existence. I do not believe it, Zenith said with all the calmness she could muster. She carefully folded the letter in half and handed it back to Salem. Read it, but do not believe it. It is a mistake, a lie. Salem walked slowly over to the fire, standing with his back to the flames as he read through the letter once, then once more, far more slowly. I knew some of this, he said, finally looking up. I knew that Wolfstar came to Naya in the Dome of the Moon. I knew how Naya died. But this promise that Wolfstar made to Naya, that she would live again, that I did not know. But Mother did know. She knew, all these years, knew and never told me. Why? Is that why my mother did not give me a star name, Zenith wondered? Because she knew I was Naya reborn? Why? Salem shrugged helplessly, spreading his hands out. Zenith, I don't know. Maybe she felt there was no point telling you until Wolfstar reappeared. Gods, I don't know. So she let me find out this way. Zenith, Salem came back to sit by her side, his voice gentle. If there is one thing I have learned from my parents' lives, and from my own, it is that we are all born with a destiny. My parents were into their third decades before their destinies became clear to them, and no! Zenith took the letter from Salem's hand and began to turn it over and over in her own. I will not accept it, and I have had to accept that my destiny is Star Sun, and my burden is Tensendor. I am Zenith, no one else. Yes, my dear, yes, but it is apparent you also have Naya's soul and many of her memories, and no! How many times had she shouted that negative tonight? Zenith numbly wondered in the dark recess of her mind, and how many more times would she have to shout it? And, Salem continued, speaking over Zenith's increasing denials, you still have life. You have all of your own memories and experiences. You must only come to terms with the fact that you also have a set of memories and experiences that stretch back before your birth. No! Zenith leapt to her feet and began to pace restlessly about the room. What was truly, truly terrifying was the fact that as she had shouted that no, some part of her mind had whispered back, yes. She was Naya reborn, born to live out Naya's yearnings, Naya's life. No, she was Naya reborn, both mother and daughter to Azur. No, She was Naya reborn, and what that meant was that she no longer had any say in her own life, because her life would now be lived according to Naya's dictates, Naya's dreams. No, she would live her life locked in the arms of Naya's lover. "I am not Naya," she whispered, low and fierce. How could she be? "Zenith, listen to me." Now Salem was before her. His face was determined, his voice hard. "Zenith, you will have to adjust, but you will be able to—" "No, no, no!" Zenith wrenched herself from Salem's grasp and stumbled across the room. With vicious movements she tore the letter into shreds and threw the pieces into the fire. Naya is dead, not living in her, not. Had this misplaced ghost always been hiding in her bodily spaces, waiting for a moment she could— No, she could not even think it. "No!" Zenith screamed one last time and fled from the chamber. Salem stood in the middle of his chamber staring after her, trying to make sense of her reaction. It had been shock, of course, but surely if she calmed down, thought it through, and accepted it, then it would be easier. But perhaps she'd best be left alone for a while. Perhaps all she needed was time. Then Salem remembered how Wolfstar had kissed Riverstar, and his eyes had clouded over. Not Riverstar. No. Better Zenith. Better by far. Zenith must learn to accept Wolfstar, and Wolfstar surely would not harm her if he loved her. "Leave her alone for a few days, Wolfstar," he said into the empty room. But he spread the words over through Ten Sendor with his power, seeking out the enchanter. Give her time. Somehow he felt, if not saw, Wolfstar's predatory grin.